What does it mean to walk away from Hollywood at the height of fame? What does it mean to give up the stage, the applause, the dazzling lights, for something far more personal, far more human? This is the story of Ann-Margret, one of the most glamorous, electrifying stars of her generation. A woman whose beauty and talent captivated the world, who lit up screens alongside legends like Elvis Presley and Steve McQueen, and who could have remained in the spotlight for decades more. But Ann-Margret's life was never just about stardom. At its core, her story is about love. When her husband, actor Roger Smith, fell seriously ill, she made a decision few in Hollywood would ever make. She stepped away for nearly 30 years. She devoted herself to his care, proving that true success isn't measured in awards or applause, but in loyalty, sacrifice, and resilience. Today, we revisit her extraordinary journey from a small-town girl in Sweden to an international superstar. From red carpets to quiet nights of caregiving, and uncover the enduring power of a love story that outshone even the brightest lights of Hollywood. Ann-Margret Olsen was born on April 28, 1941, in Valsgibben, a small village in northern Sweden. Her early childhood was shaped by simplicity, long winters, modest living, and the strong embrace of family. Her father, Gustav, emigrated to the United States to build a better life, leaving Ann-Margret and her mother, Anna, to follow later. In 1946, when Ann-Margret was just 5 years old, she and her mother boarded a ship for America. They reunited with Gustav in Illinois, where he worked tirelessly to provide for the family. Like many immigrant families, they faced struggles, language barriers, financial challenges, but they also carried dreams. For Ann-Margret, those dreams would soon find expression in music and dance. As a child, she showed remarkable talent. She sang in church, performed in local shows, and by her teenage years, her charisma was undeniable. Teachers, neighbors, and friends all noticed something special about her. She wasn't just another Midwestern girl. She had star quality at Northwestern University. Ann-Margret formerly studied acting and theater. But it wasn't the classroom that shaped her. Most it was the stage. Her performances caught attention. Quickly, and before long, she was part of a group called the Their act mixed singing, dancing, and comedy, a preview of the energy that would later define Ann-Margret's career. A move to Los Angeles brought her to the doorstep of Hollywood. And from the moment she walked into auditions, it was clear Ann-Margret wasn't just another hopeful actress. She was unforgettable. In 1901, Ann-Margret's big break arrived when she was signed by 20th Century Fox. That same year, she made her film debut in Pocketful of Miracles, directed by Frank Capra. Even in a supporting role, her presence lit up the screen. Critics and audiences alike couldn't take their eyes off her. But it was her next projects that made her a household name. In 1963, Ann-Margret starred in Bye Bye Birdie, a musical comedy that showcased her singing, dancing, and effervescent personality. The opening number, Bye Bye Birdie, filmed with Ann-Margret singing directly into the camera, became iconic. Suddenly, she was no longer just an actress, she was a sensation. Hollywood loved her fiery red hair, her husky voice, her natural charm. She was marketed as the next big thing, often compared to Marilyn Monroe. But unlike Marilyn, Ann-Margret exuded a kind of energy that was playful, modern, and undeniably her own. And then came Elvis. In 1964, Ann-Margret starred alongside Elvis Presley in Viva Las Vegas. The chemistry between the two was undeniable. On screen, their flirtation crackled. Off-screen, rumors swirled of a romance that went beyond the script, whether friends or lovers. What's certain is that Elvis and Ann-Margret shared a unique bond. She later described him as her soulmate, someone who understood her in a way no one else did. Their dance sequences in Viva Las Vegas remain some of the most electric musical numbers in film history. Audiences were captivated not just by Elvis, but by Ann-Margret, who matched his charisma step for step. She wasn't overshadowed, she stood as his equal, something few of his co-stars managed. For Ann-Margret, the film solidified her reputation. She wasn't just a pretty face, she was a powerhouse performer who could hold her own with the king of rock and roll. By the mid-1960s, Ann-Margret was a sensation. Her energy on screen made her a natural fit for musicals and comedies, but she wanted more. She was determined to prove she wasn't just a glamorous performer, she was a serious actress. In 1965, she starred in The Cincinnati Kid opposite Steve McQueen. It was a shift in tone, darker, more dramatic. Ann-Margret played Melba, the seductive and manipulative wife of a poker player, and her performance drew critical praise. Audiences who had once seen her as the sweet girl of Bye Bye Birdie were now confronted with her ability to portray complexity and edge. Her career continued to evolve in films like Once a Thief and The Swinger. Though some projects were uneven, they showcased her willingness to take risks. She wasn't afraid to experiment, to stretch beyond the safe confines of Hollywood's expectations. But fame came with challenges. Hollywood, always eager to typecast, sometimes struggled to place Ann-Margret. Was she the next Marilyn? Was she a singer, a dancer, a dramatic actress? In truth, she was all of these things and more. But being all of them at once meant she never fit neatly into a single box. Still, she pressed on, balancing her film work with a growing music career. By the late 60s, Ann-Margret was performing on stages across America, delivering electrifying concerts that fused her acting charisma with rock and roll energy. Her live performances were legendary, wild, kinetic, impossible to ignore. Elvis himself once remarked that she was the female version of me. It was around this time that fate introduced Ann-Margret to the man who would change her. Life forever, Roger Smith. Roger was already known to audiences from his role in the TV series 77 Sunset Strip. Handsome, charismatic, and intelligent, he had made his mark in Hollywood as both an actor and later as a producer. The two met in the early 1960s, and there was an immediate spark. But this wasn't just another Hollywood romance. Ann-Margret and Roger connected on a deeper level. He admired her work ethic, her drive, and her ability to remain grounded despite the glare of fame. She admired his intelligence, his protective nature, and the sense of stability he brought to her whirlwind life. In 1967, Ann-Margret and Roger Smith were married in Las Vegas. For some, the marriage came as a surprise. Hollywood couples were notorious for quick breakups and scandals. Few believed that two people, both working in the entertainment industry, could withstand the pressures of fame. But Ann-Margret and Roger proved them all wrong. From the beginning, their marriage was built on loyalty and partnership. Roger stepped back from acting and instead took on the role of Ann-Margret's manager, guiding her career and protecting her from the exploitative side of Hollywood. For Ann-Margret, this was invaluable. She trusted him completely, and together, they built not only a marriage, but a professional team. But life had more tests in store. In 1972, while performing at Lake Tahoe, Ann-Margret suffered a devastating accident. During a stage performance, she fell 22 feet from an elevated platform. To the stage below, the impact was catastrophic. Her face was shattered, and doctors feared she might never look the same again, let alone perform. For Ann-Margret, who had built her career on her presence and charisma, it could have been the end. But it was here that her resilience and the strength of her partnership with Roger truly showed. He stayed by her side constantly, supporting her through excruciating surgeries and rehabilitation. Ann-Margret endured months of painful recovery, during which her jaw had to be wired shut. She fought through not only the physical pain, but the fear of losing everything she had worked for. Yet, within just 10 weeks, she returned to the stage. Performing once again in Las Vegas, the audience erupted in applause. Not just for her singing, but for her courage. The accident transformed her image. She was no longer simply a glamorous starlet, she was a survivor. And audiences, who had once admired her beauty, now admired her strength. The 1970s brought new opportunities. Ann-Margret took on roles that pushed her beyond the light-hearted musicals of her youth. In 1971, she starred in Carnal Knowledge opposite Jack Nicholson. Critics who had once dismissed her as a pretty face were now forced to acknowledge her depth and range. She followed this with films like Tommy in 1975, a rock opera directed by Ken Russell. In it, she played Nora Walker. Character, the role was intense, surreal, and at times shocking. Her fearless performance earned her a second Academy Award, nomination this time for Best Actress. These films cemented Ann-Margret's reputation as a serious actress. No longer just the girl who danced with Elvis, she had become a force in Hollywood, versatile, daring, and unafraid of reinvention. And through it all, Roger was her manager, her protector, her partner. Their marriage had now lasted longer than most Hollywood unions, and each trial they faced only seemed to strengthen their bond by the dawn of the 1980s. Ann-Margret had already proven herself survivor of a devastating accident, Oscar-nominated actress, and one of the most versatile women in Hollywood. But she wasn't finished. She returned to the screen with a new sense of maturity and depth. In films like The Return of the Soldier, 1982, and Tiger by the Tail, she showed she could move effortlessly between drama and lighter roles. Television, too, offered her new opportunities. She starred in a series of TV movies and miniseries that brought her into living rooms across America. Her performances in Who Will Love My Children, 1983, and A Streetcar Named Desire, 1984, in which she played Blanche Dubois, won her critical acclaim. For many viewers, these roles revealed a side of Ann-Margret they had never seen before. Vulnerable and emotionally fearless. Awards followed, including Golden Globe wins, further solidifying her as not just a starlet of the 1960s, but a respected actress with staying power. But even as her career enjoyed a revival, storm clouds were forming in her personal life. Roger Smith, the man who had been Ann-Margret's rock for nearly 2 decades, began to experience serious health problems. Diagnosed with a rare neuromuscular disease called myasthenia gravis, along with other complications, Roger's once vibrant energy began to fade. For many couples in Hollywood, illness spelled the end. Careers and ambitions took precedence, and personal struggles were often left in the shadows. But for Ann-Margret, there was no question. The woman who had dazzled audiences with her talent and beauty now turned all of her energy toward her husband. Her schedule shifted. Instead of chasing the next big role or living permanently on film sets, she rearranged her life to accommodate Roger's needs. She became his advocate, his companion, his caregiver. Hollywood was still calling, but Ann-Margret was no longer listening in the same way. Her heart was elsewhere. In interviews years later, she would reflect simply, "He's my life." It was during these years that Ann-Margret made one of the most remarkable choices of her life. At the very height of her fame, with offers still on the table, she began stepping back from Hollywood. Not completely, she would still take select projects, but she deliberately turned down the kind of demanding, high-profile roles that had once defined her career. Why? Because Roger needed her. For nearly 3 decades, Ann-Margret devoted herself to his care. She managed his treatments, accompanied him to countless medical appointments, and provided the emotional strength he needed during the darkest times. In a town built on fleeting fame and fragile egos, she quietly proved that loyalty mattered more than celebrity. This devotion didn't go unnoticed. Friends in Hollywood admired her sacrifice, often remarking that while Ann-Margret could have lived in the spotlight forever, she instead chose love. But what made this choice even more powerful was that she never once described it as a burden. To Ann-Margret, caring for Roger was simply part of the vows they had taken, the bond they had built. "He gave me stability," she once said. "Now I give him everything I have." For almost 30 years, this was Ann-Margret's life. While the public occasionally saw her in television roles, award shows, or rare interviews behind the scenes, she was living a story few Hollywood stars ever would. The story of devotion. Roger's illness required constant attention, yet Ann-Margret never faltered. She turned down countless opportunities, adjusted her career, and chose the private life of a wife over the glamour of Hollywood red carpets. Think about that for a moment. For an actress who had once been compared to Marilyn Monroe, who had danced with Elvis Presley, who had been offered scripts that could have kept her a leading lady into her later years, she gave it all up, and not out of obligation, but out of love. This quiet, steady sacrifice redefined her legacy. She was no longer just a star. She was a symbol of loyalty, resilience, and the enduring power of marriage in an industry famous for breakups and betrayals. For Roger, those years meant everything. He often said that Ann-Margret saved his life not by curing his illness, but by giving him dignity, care, and companionship. For Ann-Margret, it was never about sacrifice. It was about love. As the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, Ann-Margret's world remained centered not on movie sets, but on her home. Roger's health was fragile, and every day brought new challenges. Myasthenia gravis, a disease that weakens the body's muscles, is relentless. For many, it strips away independence. But Roger had something many patients do, not a wife who refused to let him face it alone. Ann-Margret became his shield. She was there for every doctor's visit, every medication change, every quiet night when illness felt overwhelming. Friends who visited the couple often remarked that their home wasn't filled with sadness, it was filled with warmth. Roger, even in illness, smiled often, because Ann-Margret made sure of it. For nearly 3 decades, she managed this balance, occasionally stepping into the public eye for a role, a concert, or an award, then retreating back into the life she cherished most. The role of Roger's companion and caretaker, in 2000, she appeared in The 10th Kingdom, a fantasy miniseries that introduced her to a new generation. Later, she would play guest roles in television series, bringing glimpses of her talent back to audiences. But these were always carefully chosen projects, never anything that would take her away from Roger for too long by now. Hollywood understood. Ann-Margret was not a woman who measured success by the size of her filmography. She measured it in love, loyalty, and the quiet victories of devotion. In 2017, after years of battling illness with dignity and courage, Roger Smith passed away at the age of 84. For Ann-Margret, it was the end of an era, the closing chapter of a marriage that had lasted 50 years, half a century. In Hollywood, where marriages often collapse in months, theirs had endured decades of triumphs, tragedies, and unwavering devotion. Roger had been her manager, her protector, her partner, and, above all, her great love. When news of his passing was shared, tributes poured in not just for Roger as an actor, but for the remarkable marriage he and Ann-Margret had built. Colleagues, friends, and fans spoke not only of their love story, but of the extraordinary loyalty Ann-Margret had shown. For her, the grief was immense. She had built her life around him for so long that living without Roger meant learning to breathe again in a world that suddenly felt quieter, emptier. And yet, just as she had after her accident in Lake Tahoe, Ann-Margret showed resilience. She didn't disappear into grief, she carried Roger's memory with her, honoring him by living with the same courage he had admired in her for so many years. In the years following Roger's passing, Ann-Margret has continued to live with dignity, grace, and a spirit that still inspires those around her, though she is no longer the fiery young starlet who stole the screen in Viva Las Vegas. She remains deeply respected as both a Hollywood legend and a woman of extraordinary character. In 2021, Ann-Margret released her album Born to be Wild, proving that her passion for performance had never faded. Even in her 80s, her voice carried the same fire, the same sparkle that captivated audiences decades earlier. And yet, behind each public appearance, there is always the shadow of Roger, her partner, her love, her other half. Friends say she still speaks of him often, with the warmth and fondness of someone who never saw caregiving as sacrifice, but simply as part of the great love story of her life. She has also spoken in rare interviews about gratitude for having shared such a deep connection for so long. He was everything, she once reflected, and I was so lucky. Ann-Margret's story is not just about Hollywood glitz and glamour. It's not only about her electrifying performances or her iconic roles. It's about the choices she made when the cameras weren't rolling. At the peak of fame, she chose devotion. At the height of success, she chose love. For nearly 30 years, she walked away from the spotlight so she could stand by Roger Smith's side. That choice redefined her legacy. She showed the world that real strength isn't in stardom, it's in sacrifice. Real beauty isn't in red carpets, it's in resilience. And real love isn't in grand gestures, it's in the quiet daily act of being there when it matters most. Today, when people look back on Ann-Margret's career, they see 2 stories woven together. The dazzling Hollywood icon who danced with Elvis and earned Oscar nominations, and the devoted wife who gave everything to care for the man she loved. Her story reminds us of something simple but profound. Fame fades, beauty changes, but love, true love, can last forever. Ann-Margret's life has been filled with lights, music, and applause. But when history remembers her, it may not be the roles she played that shine brightest. It may instead be the role she lived every single day for nearly 30 years, that of a devoted wife, a loyal partner, and a woman who chose love above all else. Because in the end, Ann-Margret didn't just show us how to be a star, she showed us how to be human. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive our new content.